Deep in the stifling, mosquito-ridden forests of East Prussia, a heavy stillness hung over the heavily fortified military compound known as the Wolf Lair. It was July 20th of July, 1944. Inside a sweltering wooden briefing barracks, a decorated German army officer stood just feet away from the most destructive dictator in modern history. Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg carried a leather briefcase, its interior harboring a ticking chemical fuse, slowly eating through a retaining wire. The acid was silently dissolving the barrier between a quiet morning and a violent upheaval that promised to alter the trajectory of the Second World War. As Adolf Hitler leaned over massive oak tables to inspect military maps, Stauffenberg carefully slid the briefcase beneath the heavy wooden surface, positioning it as close to his target as possible. Murmuring an excuse about needing to make an urgent telephone call, the colonel quietly slipped out of the crowded room. He walked briskly past the inner security perimeter, his heart hammering against his ribs, waiting for the inevitable roar. Moments later, a deafening explosion shattered the summer air, sending smoke, splintered wood, and shattered glass erupting from the barracks windows. Stauffenberg watched the devastation, utterly convinced that the tyrant was dead. This brazen act of high treason was not born of sudden impulse, but was the culmination of a profound psychological breaking point. For years, the aristocratic officer class had wrestled with their oaths of loyalty to a regime that was systematically dragging their nation into an abyss of unparalleled barbarity. Stauffenberg, once a believer in the resurgence of German power, had witnessed the mass executions and the systemic slaughter on the Eastern Front. The moral revulsion festering within him transformed his deep-seated patriotism into a burning mandate for tyrannicide, demanding that he sever his sworn allegiance to salvage whatever remained of his country's soul. The conspiracy required navigating an environment where the state's apparatus was explicitly designed to root out and annihilate dissent. Nazi Germany operated on a foundation of pervasive paranoia and total surveillance. To plot against the head of state was to invite the most brutal forms of interrogation and execution, not just for the conspirators but for their entire families. Yet the realization that millions more would perish if the war continued unchecked compelled a shadow network of high-ranking military officials, diplomats, and civilian intellectuals to embrace the perilous path of ultimate betrayal. Their strategy was brilliantly Machiavellian, a term describing the employment of cunning and duplicity in statecraft. The conspirators decided to weaponize the regime's own contingency plans against it. They focused on Operation Valkyrie, a legitimate military protocol designed to mobilize the reserve army to protect the government in the event of a national emergency or internal uprising. By secretly rewriting the Valkyrie orders, the shadow network planned to assassinate the dictator, declare that a coup by rogue party factions was underway, and use the reserve army to seize control of Berlin, disarming the SS and arresting the regime's loyalists. Gathering this clandestine network required an agonizing dance of coded conversations and unspoken understanding. Men like Major General Henning von Tresckow and General Friedrich Olbricht risked everything to weave this web of subversion right under the noses of the Gestapo. Every meeting in the darkened offices of the Bendler Block military headquarters carried the threat of discovery. The psychological strain of this dual existence was immense, requiring the conspirators to outwardly project unwavering devotion to the war effort while internally orchestrating its violent decapitation. The emotional toll of orchestrating such monumental deceit pushed these men to the very edges of their sanity. They were forced to engage in a form of institutional gaslighting, a psychological manipulation where they repeatedly affirmed the regime's false reality of impending victory, all while actively engineering its collapse. To look colleagues in the eye, to salute the swastika, and to issue orders in the name of a man they intended to obliterate required a compartmentalization so severe it fractured their sense of self. They were dead men walking, operating on borrowed time. The physical execution of the July 20 plot fell to Stauffenberg, a man severely wounded in North Africa, missing his right hand, 2 fingers on his left and his left eye, arming a British-made pencil detonator with a pair of specialized pliers, using only 3 fingers, was an agonizingly difficult task. The explosive itself consisted of 2 blocks of plastic explosive, sufficient to obliterate everyone within the confined space of a concrete bunker. However, the venue for the daily military conference had been unexpectedly moved from a subterranean bunker to a wooden surface-level barracks due to the oppressive summer heat. On the morning of the assassination attempt, the tension within the conspirators' ranks was palpable. Stauffenberg and his adjutant flew from Berlin to the Wolf Lair, carrying the explosives wrapped in shirts inside their luggage. Upon arrival, the oppressive, heavily guarded atmosphere of the compound pressed in on them. Every checkpoint, every scrutinizing glance from an SS guard threatened to unravel months of meticulous planning. The sheer audacity of carrying a bomb into the most fiercely protected enclave in Europe underscored the desperation driving their mission. Just minutes before the briefing was scheduled to begin, Stauffenberg retreated to a washroom to arm the device. The acid fuse was crushed, initiating a silent 10-minute countdown. But as he struggled to arm the second block of explosive, a sergeant knocked on the door, urging him to hurry. In a fateful decision dictated by time and physical limitation, Stauffenberg placed only the single armed block into his briefcase, handing the second, unarmed explosive to his adjutant. He entered the map room with only half the destructive power intended for the assassination. Inside the sweltering room, over 20 military personnel crowded around the heavy oak map table. Stauffenberg pushed the briefcase under the table, positioning it on the inside of a thick wooden support leg, directing the blast toward his target. After he slipped away to make his phantom phone call, another officer, finding the briefcase in his way as he leaned over the map, inadvertently pushed it to the outside of the massive wooden leg. That single mundane adjustment placed a thick shield of solid oak directly between the explosive and the dictator. When the bomb detonated at 12:42 in the afternoon, the blast wave tore through the wooden structure, blowing out the roof and walls. 4 men were killed, and many others were severely wounded. But the heavy table leg had absorbed the brunt of the lethal force directed at the center of the room. Adolf Hitler emerged from the smoking ruins with singed hair, a ruptured eardrum, and torn trousers, but he was very much alive. The immediate chaos masked the failure, allowing the architect of the blast to escape the compound. Believing his mission was accomplished, Stauffenberg bluffed his way past the outer checkpoints and boarded a plane back to Berlin. For 3 agonizing hours, he was entirely cut off from communication. During this critical window, the conspiracy required bold, decisive action from the network in the capital. The Valkyrie orders needed to be issued immediately to mobilize the troops and seize the government quarter. However, the conspirators left behind in the Bendler block hesitated, paralyzed by conflicting reports trickling in from East Prussia. General Olbricht, a key figure in the plot, refused to initiate the military takeover without absolute confirmation of the dictator's death. The minutes ticked by, bleeding into hours, and the vital momentum of the coup evaporated. The element of surprise, the most crucial weapon in their arsenal, was squandered in a fog of indecision. By the time Stauffenberg landed in Berlin and forcefully demanded the activation of the reserve army, the regime's loyalists were already beginning to piece together the truth of the explosion. As the Valkyrie orders finally went out, a bizarre and chaotic power struggle erupted across the capital. Units of the reserve army, unaware of the true nature of their orders, began securing key government buildings. For a fleeting moment, it appeared the shadow network might succeed in their monumental deception. But the regime's communication lines, which the conspirators had failed to completely sever, crackled with frantic updates. The Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, remained barricaded in his office, armed with a direct telephone line to the Wolf's Lair. The turning point arrived when a loyalist officer, Major Otto Ernst Riemer, was sent to arrest Goebbels. Instead of surrendering, Goebbels connected Riemer directly to the Führer. Hearing the unmistakable voice of the man he had sworn to protect, Riemer was ordered to crush the rebellion with ruthless efficiency. The illusion of a legitimate state emergency shattered instantly. The troops who had been unwittingly mobilized for a coup abruptly changed their allegiance back to the regime, turning their weapons against the very officers who had issued their marching orders. By late evening, the conspiracy had completely collapsed. The Bendler block, once the nerve center of the rebellion, transformed into a trap for the conspirators. Loyal troops stormed the building, leading to a brief, bloody firefight in the corridors. The masterminds of the July 20th plot were disarmed and arrested. The desperate gamble to end the war and sever the head of the Nazi beast had failed, leaving the perpetrators exposed to the full, terrifying wrath of a regime built on absolute terror. In a desperate bid to distance himself from the treason and save his own life, General Friedrich Fromm, commander of the reserve army who had tacitly tolerated the plot, convened a hasty drumhead court-martial. In the courtyard of the military headquarters, illuminated by the glaring headlights of military vehicles, Fromm ordered the immediate execution of the core conspirators. It was a frantic, blood-soaked attempt to silence the men who could implicate him in the sprawling conspiracy, a brutal betrayal of the very officers who had risked everything. Shortly after midnight, Claus von Stauffenberg was led into the courtyard to face the firing squad. As the rifles were raised, he shouted a final, defiant proclamation of his enduring patriotism, a cry that echoed briefly against the stone walls before being drowned out by the crack of gunfire. The architect of the most significant internal threat to the regime lay dead, his body hastily buried in his uniform, only to be exhumed and cremated by the SS the following day. his ashes scattered to erase his memory. The dictator's survival ignited a campaign of retribution that was biblical in its ferocity. The Gestapo launched a massive dragnet, arresting over 7,000 people in connection with the conspiracy. The regime invoked the ancient and brutal concept of Sippenhaft, a form of collective family punishment where the relatives of the accused, including women and children, were imprisoned or sent to concentration camps. It was a stark demonstration of absolute power, designed to ensure that the very thought of rebellion would be forever associated with the annihilation of one's entire bloodline. The vengeance of the state was formalized in the notorious People's Court, presided over by the fanatical Judge Roland Freisler. The trials were grotesque theatrical performances, designed not to seek justice but to inflict maximum humiliation. The accused officers were stripped of their belts and false teeth, forced to hold up their trousers while Freisler screamed torrents of abuse at them. The proceedings were filmed for the dictator's personal viewing, capturing the agonizing degradation of Germany's former elite before they were sentenced to agonizing deaths. The executions were carried out at Plötzensee prison with medieval cruelty. The condemned were hung from meat hooks using piano wire, ensuring a slow, strangulating death. The sheer barbarity of the state's revenge forces a confrontation with a profound ethical question regarding whether the conspiracy was a Pyrrhic victory. This term describes a success that comes with such a devastating toll that it is tantamount to defeat. In purely military terms, the plot was a catastrophic failure, resulting in the decimation of the German resistance and the prolongation of the war. Yet, in the realm of human morality, the conspirators achieved something transcendent. They operated under a twisted shadow of lex talionis, the law of retaliation demanding an eye for an eye. The regime had systematically destroyed the moral fabric of the nation, and the conspirators sought to strike back with lethal force to restore it. While they failed to deliver the fatal blow, they succeeded in demonstrating that even within the darkest heart of a totalitarian nightmare, the human conscience could not be entirely extinguished by terror. The failure of the bomb to kill its target meant that the war raged on for another 10 agonizing months. In that final apocalyptic chapter of the conflict, millions more soldiers and civilians perished, and the machinery of the Holocaust continued its grim work. The destruction of German cities accelerated, and the nation was ultimately partitioned by conquering armies. The heavy oak table leg in the Wolf Lair stands as one of history's most tragic fulcrums, a mundane object that inadvertently condemned millions to death by sparing a single tyrant. Today, the legacy of the July 20 plot remains a complex tapestry of guilt, courage, and ultimate sacrifice. For decades after the war, the conspirators were viewed with suspicion by some of their own countrymen, seen as oath-breakers in a culture that prized military obedience. But history has rightfully reframed them as martyrs who chose the agonizing path of treason to combat absolute evil. Their meticulously plotted deception shattered the myth of a monolithic, unified Nazi Germany, proving that a fierce, internal resistance existed within the very core of the military machine. The echoes of that ticking briefcase continue to resonate through the corridors of history, serving as a chilling reminder of the profound cost of confronting tyranny. The narrative of Claus von Stauffenberg and his fellow conspirators illuminates the darkest corners of human nature, where the line between loyalty and complicity blurs into nothingness. Their desperate, doomed gamble stands as a testament to the fact that when a regime embraces absolute darkness, the ultimate act of betrayal becomes the highest expression of moral courage, a light striking desperately against the encroaching void.